Hello, and welcome to Connected with Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments, and business trends shaping the global economy. I'm Ben Haas, a partner in our FDA practice group based in Washington and global vice chair of the Healthcare and Life Sciences practice group. In this episode, we'll discuss developments in FDA's approach to off-label communications. I'm joined today by my colleagues in the Healthcare and Life Sciences practice in Washington, D.C., counsel Monica Groat and associate Nate Beaton. They focus their practices on regulatory litigation and transactional matters involving the FDA and the life sciences industry. Welcome.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having us, Ben.
Monica, let me start with you. What do you think prompted FDA to revisit its recommendations for off-label communications?
Great question, Ben. I think in the past few years, there's been an unofficial gradual expansion of safe harbors for truthful and non-misleading communications about off-label uses. And this unofficial expansion may be, at least in part, a response to the challenges that FDA faced with respect to its enforcement activity on First Amendment grounds. The key cases, which our listeners may be familiar with, are Coronia, Amarin, and Pacira. The Coronia decision by the Second Circuit kicked things off in 2012 and made it clear that, at least within the Second Circuit, FDA should permit truthful, non-misleading communications about off-label uses. The Amarin and Pacira settlements, both in the Southern District of New York in 2015, incorporated the holding of Coronia. And I think these three cases can be taken as a whole as a warning by the court that FDA may want to think twice before prosecuting companies or their employees for making truthful, non-misleading communications about an unapproved use of an otherwise approved drug. There's some limitations to these cases. They're obviously all within the Second Circuit. They were focused on speech conduct as opposed to other sorts of conduct, and they were all cases regarding criminal liability. But I think the overall takeaway is that these three cases, along with decreasing FDA enforcement activity, made it a good time for FDA to reconsider articulating its safe harbors for truthful, non-misleading communications in a draft guidance document.
Very interesting. So, Nate, how does this draft guidance expand the safe harbor? Didn't FDA already allow manufacturers to engage in legitimate scientific exchange?
They did, but the draft guidance offers some additional information and sort of repackages the way that FDA has approached truthful and non-misleading communications about unapproved uses of approved or cleared medical products. First, FDA now refers to these types of communications as scientific information on unapproved uses, or SIUU, which is a new category. And this new category includes information that's a bit different than some of the safe harbors that FDA had previously announced. I think that using some of the facts of the Amarin case might provide sort of a good illustration of what may have changed under the new draft guidance. If you look at the Amarin case, the types of what we'll now call SIUU that were used to promote the drug in question included 13 peer-reviewed scientific publications, a statement and a chart summarizing the results of that trial, and then 3 additional statements, again, describing the results of a clinical trial. And if you sort of overlay that against the new draft guidance, that new category of SIU includes public scientific or medical journal articles, what we'll call reprints, published clinical reference resources, and then, most critically, firm-generated presentations of scientific information from an accompanying published reprint. And it's really that third category, the firm-generated presentations, that's a new type of SIUU that we haven't seen FDA articulate as a safe harbor in the past. And so this draft guidance suggests that those firm-generated presentations are a new permissible category, provided that they meet the criteria set forth in the draft guidance, including that they're based on an accompanying published reprint. What this means in practice is that a firm-generated presentation that meets those criteria, derived from an appropriate reprint, would not be treated as evidence of a new intended use, and therefore would be effectively a safe harbor for those types of communications. But again, if this information is not previously discussed or summarized in a reprint, FDA would likely still take the position that the presentation is evidence of a new intended use.
A great point. Let's examine firm-generated presentations through a few examples. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on its breadth. Monica, for instance, do we think FDA would exercise enforcement discretion against a manufacturer for distributing, say, note cards containing SIUU communications at a medical conference? What about a poster explaining the tolerability of a certain drug in a subset of patients, putting up a display for discussion at a medical conference? What do you think?
Great examples. And let's take the poster first, because I think that may fit really well within FDA's new firm created presentations category. The draft guidance itself is set up as a fairly lengthy Q&A section. And within the first couple questions, it enumerates a couple factors that can be applied to the presentation to see whether it falls within this new SIUU category. First, and this really isn't a change from prior FDA guidance, FDA makes clear that the full reprint itself should accompany the presentation. So in this case, if the poster is explaining the tolerability in a patient subset, the reprint that discusses that very issue would have to accompany the poster. So if the poster was up at a conference and the company wanted to distribute copies of the poster, the underlying reprint would have to be distributed along with the poster. Second, the guidance mentions that the SIUU communication, again in this case the poster, should include a disclosure that it was generated by the particular company, fairly straightforward. The draft guidance also notes that persuasive marketing techniques should not be used. In the case of a scientific poster, many of our audience members or listeners may be familiar with them. They're really just full of science and it's not a marketing tool, so less of a concern there. The poster should also be separate and distinct from promotional communications. Here, the guidance specifically mentions that the poster itself at a conference should be physically distanced from a promotional booth for the approved uses at a conference. And if copies of the poster are being distributed, while the poster could be accompanied by the reprint, as I previously mentioned, it shouldn't also be accompanied by promotional material. I think that a scientific conference is a platform that will enable all of these recommendations, so the poster and distribution of it will fulfill that criteria. The guidance does note that the presentation should use plain language to facilitate comprehension, and that's an interesting concept when it comes to communicating fairly high-level technical issues. But I think the key here to keep in mind is the audience. Likely this communication would be for and to scientists or other healthcare professionals. So as long as the poster fits within the plain languages that scientists or healthcare professionals would use in that case, I think it would satisfy that criteria. And then one other criterion to keep in mind, the poster, in this case an example of SIUU, should not present conclusions about the safety or efficacy of an unapproved use without attributing that statement expressly to the reprint. Again, here in this case, we're talking about a poster that's based on data presented in a reprint, so I think it would fulfill that criteria. So overall, I do think the draft guidance may give a company a little more flexibility to not only display a poster containing this scientific research at a conference, but actually share copies of it as long as it fulfills these criteria. Nate, do you have any other thoughts on this poster example?
Yeah, no, I agree that the poster presents I think a nice example of the type of communications, the type of SIUU communications that would be countenanced by this draft guidance. I think in Ben's question about sort of note cards or other short summaries, I think that those, however, continue to be areas that could potentially have some practical challenges for firms that are seeking to communicate SIUU. As you mentioned in connection with the poster, there is this reprint requirement under the draft guidance. A manufacturer would need to provide full reprints of the underlying scientific or academic publications along with a firm-generated presentation. I think that poses just some practical limitations when you're talking about note cards or other short, concise takeaways. And then beyond just the publication itself, the draft guidance indicates that where the reprint, where that academic publication doesn't include other material information about aspects of the study or its limitations, it may be necessary for the manufacturer to provide even more information about the study, to provide context on its design, on the limitations of the study, etc., which is just yet more information that would need to be included. So I think in practice, when you're talking about a short, concise note card with SIUU, I'm just not sure that it would be as effective or desirable for firms to utilize as a tool when we're talking about that much additional accompanying information. And then in addition to that, the content requirements set forth in the draft guidance, I think, are also going to be challenging in connection with some of these limited space communications. The draft guidance, for instance, permits manufacturers, as you mentioned, to use plain language to facilitate comprehension, which I think is helpful. But, in order to hit that truthful, not misleading, factual, and unbiased bogey set forth in the guidance, there's a number of other types of contextual information that FDA expects to see. That statement that the unapproved use has not been approved by the FDA, that its safety and effectiveness for the use has not been established, and then disclosure of certain information about the approved use of the product, whether that's limitations of use in the FDA required label, warnings, contraindications, precautions, restrictions, things of that nature, might also, again, need to be included in the content of a firm-generated presentation in order to comply with the enforcement policy set forth in the draft guidance. And so I think that's another example of sort of the practical limitations of using these for some of these sort of concise note card type takeaways. And then I think in the example I also heard in the hypothetical that there's a question of this occurring at a medical conference. I think certainly the draft guidance indicates that this would be appropriate venue for SIU communications. But just as Monica mentioned with the poster, the draft guidance does identify steps that manufacturers would need to take to address the risk that these communications could be misinterpreted by healthcare providers as information about the approved use, things like using separate booths or divided spaces in order to communicate this information, and really to make sure that these unapproved use communications are separate and distinct from approved use communications.
Thank you for that, and thank you, Monica. A takeaway for me, based on that analysis, is that FDA may be creating a new safe harbor for firms to proactively communicate scientific information with healthcare providers. Is that right, Monica?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think at this point, based on the guidance and the fact that we haven't seen any enforcement activity yet, I think it's fair to say the new guidance permits firms to distribute presentations and other longer form materials that include what was formerly known as off-label information, what is now known as SIUU, as long as those presentations are accompanied by a reprint. I think in the coming years, we'll see different companies explore the boundaries of this safe harbor. And similarly, we'll see FDA decide if and when to exercise its enforcement muscle. And I think those two factors will put a little additional color on the contours of this new safe harbor.
So am I right that the only change the draft guidance makes to the universe of types of SIUU is the new firm-generated presentations category?
That's one of the changes, but there's actually also a new interesting standard for reprints. The draft guidance says that reprints must be both scientifically sound and clinically relevant.
All right, let's unpack that. What do we mean by scientifically sound and clinically relevant?
Well, I'll take a step back and start just to level set with the definition of a reprint. The draft guidance defines a reprint as a copy of an article originally published in a medical or scientific journal. Many of our listeners might be familiar. That's a fairly standard definition, nothing new there. The two concepts that are new, FDA has put a little bit of color on them, but I think they're open to a fair amount of interpretation. To meet the scientifically sound criterion, FDA says that the studies or analyses in the reprint should meet generally accepted design and other methodological standards for the particular type of study or analysis performed. To meet the clinically relevant criterion, the studies or analyses in the reprint should provide information pertinent to healthcare professionals who are engaged in making clinical practice decisions for the care of an individual patient. As I mentioned, these are fairly broad definitions. I think we'll see companies looking to explore the limits of this promotional limitations to challenging FDA on whether a particular journal article is scientifically sound. And similarly, given the vagueness of the clinically relevant criterion, I think it'll be interesting to see if FDA tries to limit the particular class or category of healthcare professionals to whom a particular reprint can be distributed.
Well said. Nate, based on our earlier discussion regarding posters, it sounds like FDA will consider whether certain reprints can serve as the basis for a firm-generated presentation by applying these new scientifically sound and clinically relevant standards. Has FDA suggested what kinds of source publications it considers not to be scientifically sound or clinically relevant?
I think that this is one of the areas that the draft guidance somewhat leaves unexplored. I think it's something that we should expect to see the sort of pressure testing or guardrail testing from industry that Monica had mentioned earlier. And just really to unpack this, I think there's sort of two ways that FDA talks about studies that might not be scientifically sound or might not be clinically relevant. I'll start with the more straightforward one first, and that's those studies or communications of information from studies that distort or based on or include fraudulent or distorted data. Those are the types of communications that I think is more straightforward, are not consistent with the enforcement policy that's announced in this draft guidance. The more interesting one, I think, is while FDA hasn't fully addressed or directly addressed what it considers to be scientifically sound or clinically relevant studies, they do provide some examples of studies that when used alone or as the sole basis for an SIUU might not meet that standard. Things like studies without an adequate comparison or control group, isolated case reports, things like that. Another example that's brought up in the draft guidance is scientific data generated in early stages of product development. There's some discussion in the draft guidance about the fact that early studies may not be predictive of the results of future studies or may not be able to be replicated. So there are some suggestion that some of those types of information may not be sufficient alone for a determination of clinical relevance. To me, that suggests that those are types of data and information that could be included as a part of SIUU communications, but perhaps would need to be part of sort of a broader constellation of information to support an SIUU communication, rather than something that could provide an independent basis or basis alone for those types of communications. I think on that note, FDA also seems to open the door for the use of real-world evidence and real-world data, those data or evidence that is collected not in a clinical trial, but from use of the product in the field, including in some cases, as relevant here, off-label use of an approved product in the field. But there is some hedging in the draft guidance, I think, about some discussion about the potential for RWE, real-world evidence, or real-world data not to be scientifically sound or clinically relevant, depending on the characteristics of the data, the nature of the analyses, et cetera. And so I think that this could present some challenges, in particular for certain categories of medical products or for certain indications. For example, for rare or ultra-rare diseases, it's going to be difficult for manufacturers perhaps to enroll a sufficient number of subjects to conduct these large-scale randomized clinical trials with robust control groups that you might see in other contexts. And so they may be more hamstrung in their ability to engage in these SIUU communications based on some of the factors that FDA has set forth here in terms of how it evaluates scientifically sound and clinically relevant information.
Okay, let me pose another hypothetical, which hopefully will help us understand how this will work in practice. Let's imagine that a company wants to share a presentation at a conference regarding the results of a phase 2 study. The phase 2 study results are summarized in a reprint that the firm intends to distribute as part of the presentation. Is FDA saying that this reprint would not meet its new scientifically sound and clinically relevant standard? Monica, what do you think?
Great question, Ben. I think the existence of the reprint in this particular case may give the company basis to distribute that. The draft guidance says that SIUU communication based on this type of early stage data alone may not fall within the safe harbor that this draft guidance establishes, but the fact that the data is published in a reprint that is presumably peer-reviewed may give some additional oomph to the data itself and move the data into the permissible category. If we take away the reprint factor, I think whether a company can discuss, let's say, phase 2 data is really an interesting one and ties back to the First Amendment cases that we discussed at the beginning. FDA, I think, would take the position that data from a phase 2 trial may not meet the truthful and non-misleading standard because the trials likely involve a small number of patients. There could be variations in dosing or different stages of the disease that the company is seeking to treat. But if scientifically the manufacturer can assert that the smaller study clearly describes the number of patients treated, the dosage of the drug that all the patients were treated with, and in general the communication clearly communicates all of the limitations of the study, it's hard to see how that communication about phase 2 data isn't truthful and non-misleading. And then FDA, I think, may have some weakness here in a sort of blanket prohibition against communicating phase 2 data that isn't shared in a reprint could be subject to a successful First Amendment challenge. Again, as we've noted throughout, I think this is a question that both companies and FDA will continue to explore over the next few years as FDA exercises its enforcement authority and companies decide whether to challenge FDA on the exercise of that enforcement authority.
Oh, wow. I mean, I think there are a lot of issues here that we could discuss at length, assuming that our listeners didn't sign up for a 3-hour podcast. Let's sort of focus on one key point that you mentioned earlier. You mentioned earlier that the new guidance, FDA sort of identifies clinically relevant studies as those that provide information pertinent to healthcare providers engaged in making clinical practice decisions. We know as well that the guidance recommends that any source publication serving as the basis, say, for a firm-generated presentation be clinically relevant. Nate, how much room do you think this clinically relevant standard leaves companies? Does it indicate that FDA will scrutinize communications to ensure that the studies supporting them actually aid in the care of an individual patient? Wouldn't FDA here potentially be interfering with the practice of medicine? What do you think?
I think it somewhat remains to be seen, but as a prediction, I think this kind of goes back to my earlier comment and comments that Monica had that this is an area that's going to be pressure tested by industry and other stakeholders. But to your point, the draft guidance does suggest, and indicate that clinically relevant information are those that are pertinent to healthcare professionals engaged in making clinical practice decisions for the care of an individual patient. It raises a lot of questions. At what point does a study or an analysis, does it become relevant, or does it no longer be relevant for the care of an individual patient? What level of generality is that appropriate or inappropriate? These are pretty critical questions that I think are largely unanswered in the guidance. But ultimately, I think there's a distinction that Monica made that I think is an important one, which is, there's a difference between the guardrails of this particular enforcement policy as articulated in the draft guidance, and that's going to be determined by FDA's enforcement approach going forward, and we'll see the guardrails there based on what FDA does, as well as potentially from future guidance from the agency or other public pronouncements from the agency. But that's perhaps separate and apart from the First Amendment itself. Depending on where FDA lands on some of these questions, stakeholders might take the view that FDA's prohibition on some of these communications on unapproved uses go beyond what's required or permitted by the First Amendment, which I think could prime us for future challenges to agency enforcement.
Thanks, Nate. Before we wrap up, I'd love to hear from Monica on the key takeaway from the guidance, and specifically, and maybe this is simplifying things a bit, but does the guidance represent a loosening of FDA's restrictions on off-label communications? Does it not, or does it remain to be seen? What do you think, Monica?
Yeah, I think in our discussion today, we've really hit on the tension raised in this guidance. On one hand, we have this new presentations category that may give manufacturers a new avenue to distribute information that they may have been less sure that they could distribute before this draft guidance released. On another hand, the bar for what a reprint is and when a reprint can be distributed and to who may really have been raised by the scientifically sound and clinically relevant standards we discussed. And, as Nate mentioned earlier, I don't think we can conclude that this guidance solves any problems that the FDA may run into with respect to the First Amendment. And I think manufacturers will continue to have to thoughtfully analyze the guidance to ensure that their content, including the presentations and reprints, meet FDA's conditions, and think about whether, if FDA is going too far, they want to challenge any enforcement activity on First Amendment grounds. We'll see comments on the draft guidance in the next few months, and after that, there's the possibility of future FDA enforcement activity. So I think this is a new chapter, but the story certainly isn't over.
Monica, Nate, that was great. Very informative.
Thanks. I enjoyed our conversation.
Ben, thanks for having us.
And thank you to our listeners for checking out this episode of our Connected with Latham podcast. You can subscribe and listen to new and archived episodes of Latham's podcasts on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. If you have questions or would like additional information, please email us using the links located in the show description. We hope you'll join us again next time.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins, LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins, LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins, LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. And you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins, LLP, 1271 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 10020. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.